gospel principles. Probably the greatest gospel principles there is. Obedience, you know, is the first law of heaven, and sacrifice brings forth the blessings of heaven. And I don't know any one individual who exemplified those two principles and taught them, not only by his word, but by his example, any more than my dad. You children, his children, those of you who knew him know that he demanded complete obedience, not only to him, but to any authority. And authority to my dad not only meant his parents or his, teachers or priesthood leaders, but any elder or any law enforcement officer, whoever they might be, or anyone that was put in a position of authority, such as a referee in a ball game. I would have been afraid in a ball game to have talked back to a referee with my dad present, because he would have personally jerked me out of the game, because he did demand complete obedience. And that's a principle that he taught his children, and I hope that it's a principle that all of us are teaching our children, because without obedience, nothing else can be learned. And sacrifice, he sacrificed much himself and expected that from those who were around him. Much of this sacrifice was the sacrifice of work. I don't think I've ever known a man that worked harder than my dad, and he had his kids right along with him, teaching them how to work that hard. And I think back now, and sometimes I think a lot of that work was just to keep his boys busy, his kids busy, his boys and his girls busy. And some things was even make-work kind of work. Jetty mentioned Ho and Loco. Every one of us hated Ho and Loco with a passion. And he just thought, and I think he was probably about the only one of all the ranchers in the country that believed right to the end that there were certain pastures you had to get free of Loco. And one of those pastures was what we call the stockyard, the milk cow pasture and the stockyards pasture, there where all of us live, up on top of the hill, where we live in that valley where the farm is, and up around on top of the hill. And another one was the buckhorn pasture, and another one was the east side pasture, and the Taylor fields, the Taylor pasture. Those four pastures, no matter what, we kept them clean of Loco. And he says, if we keep them clean long enough, they'll no longer be seed, and so eventually it'll get where nothing will grow. And then if there was any time left over after getting them clean in the spring of the year, before the Loco started to mature and go to seed, we would start working in another pasture, and we might get into a place that was blue with alfalfa, with Loco blossoms, looked like alfalfa. And we would go clean it out, and yet 100 yards this way and 100 yards that way was another one, but at least we did that much. And then if we did have time, and we were making some progress, we would even pull the Loco, and the pods were so old that they were about ready, they had already made their seed. Why, he would have us hoe it and then pile it, and we'd go back later and burn it. He had a passion against Loco. And we had Locoed cows, and that's why. They're pathetic. But after Daddy died, we didn't have much for Loco years for quite a while. And the bad year that came was the year after the big snowstorm. I think it was in '66, spring of '67. And us boys thought, well, being obedient to Daddy's principle, we ought to at least keep the Loco out of those certain pastures. So we went down to the east side pasture and hoed and got the kids that were old enough then to hoe, and we hired a bunch of Indians to come and help us hoe. And when we'd cleaned half the pasture of Loco, and that was the pasture that he says, well, we've kept it clean so long there's no seed. Well, it was almost as much Loco in it as there is alfalfa in our alfalfa field. And after we'd cleaned out half the pasture, we figured how much we'd paid in wages, and we'd paid enough to have bought that much of the pasture. So we quit, and we've never hoed any Loco since. And Daddy's probably ashamed of us because of it, but it did keep us busy. And other things things we did was hoeing field crops. You know, we watched other farmers that would cultivate their corn with a tractor, and that was good. You know, that took care of it. But Daddy wanted to go a little further, and he had, I remember the hours that Dean and I spent on Old Duke with a walking cultivator, one of us riding Duke down the rows and the other one behind the walking cultivator, and we'd go up and down, up and down. You know, a tractor would do 2 rows at once, and you ride it and go right through, but he says it's not worth putting the cultivator on. That's kind of hard to do. And it was, but he said, we don't have very much corn, so let's just do it with Old Duke and the walking cultivator. And I remember when the tossels was higher than me sitting on the horse with Old Duke, why, we'd still be riding down the rows, me on top and Dean behind the cultivator. And then after we'd cultivated, then he would take us in there with hoes to still hoe out always the cuckleburs and sunflowers. And he was always with us. And if it wasn't too heavy, he'd also have us hoe out the grass. And we had the cleanest corn in town, and we had the boys that was kept busy. But the years I dreaded the most was the cucumber years. There used to be a cash crop of cucumbers raised in the Snowflake Valley. There was a ready market for cucumbers to make pickles. And so my dad, with his farming and ranching and everything he had, I don't think he thought us boys had enough to do. And of course, he always needed a cash crop. So he would always sign up. You'd have to sign up for how many cucumbers you were going to raise. And he would sign up from 2 to 5 acres of cucumbers. And they just about had to be hoed by hand to get rid of the weeds and the sunflowers and cuckleburs, and then let the cucumbers grow and spread. And we would spend day after day after day down in those fields by Butch Gardner's. We owned those fields then, hoeing those cucumbers. And when Daddy was there, boy, we tended business. We just hoed up one row and down the next, and one row and down the next. But when he would get busy doing something else and he'd just send the boys down, why, there was a sure good spring right there by the side of the field that went into the canyon and into the creek, and that water was just as cold as that water we had up there at that picnic today. And we would spend a lot of time down there at that spring or else over at the swimming hole. But he loved to work. Fixing fence was mentioned, riding, hoeing Loco. He hated foxtail with a passion. And we would spend hours up in the Taylor fields trying to keep the foxtail out of the field. Always went across the tops of all of the ditches in all of the fields hoeing the cuckleburs out. And he kept nice, neat fields this way, and also he kept his boys busy. He was probably one of the best horsemen I ever knew. Bar none, he was the best cowman that I ever knew. He knew the cattle business. He was a good businessman with cattle, and he knew cattle better than any man that I've ever known before or since. And he loved to work with cattle. He considered himself a good horseman, and he was. In his younger years, he was an excellent bronc rider. In fact, you talk to some of his brothers, and they says that he was such a good bronc rider. You talk to some of them like Henry, and Henry says your dad would, in his younger years, would make a horse buck just because he liked to ride a bucking horse, and he was very good at it. I'll tell you a story about one bronc that he did ride that seems phenomenal to me. But in later years, when I got up a little older, he was always, he would still ride the rough horses, even when he got into his late 40s and 50s. And us kids couldn't ride a bronc. Why, he'd climb on and ride him himself. And I've seen him get thrown off through those years several times, and every time he'd get thrown off, he would get up and says, "That's the first time I've ever been thrown fair and square." And the next time he was thrown, he would say, "That's the first time I've ever been thrown fair and square." But he was a good bronc rider, and that was awful hard on his pride. But one thing that Daddy didn't do that most of his uncles did, or most of his brothers did, and I wished he had done more of it, was tell stories. You know, Uncle Gene, many of you have been around him enough to know he was a great storyteller. And his cousin Marshall Flake was a great storyteller. And Vincent's a great storyteller. But my dad never did do much storytelling. And he was quite modest about things that he had done, and I wished he would have talked more about some of his accomplishments and some of his deeds. In fact, I was with Uncle Marsh, or we called him Uncle Marsh, Marshall Flake. Many of you don't know, one time, but he was my dad's cousin. We always called him Uncle Marsh, and he asked me about a certain story about the early days of Snowflake, and I said, "No, I didn't know anything about that." And he says, "You mean your dad has never told you that story?" And I says, "No, he hasn't." He says, "Young man," this is the exact words he used, says, "Young man, your education's been sadly neglected." And in that way, he did neglect. I don't know whether it was bad, because that story was the reason the Flakes weren't supposed to like the Willises. And he said something about the Flakes liking the Willises, and I said, Marshall did, and I said, "Well, I didn't know the Flakes didn't like the Willises." He says, "You mean your dad hasn't told you why the Flakes don't like the Willises?" And yet my dad was that way, that he didn't hold those grudges. Marshall had to that day. And Marshall told me the story about the old horse race that got bad feelings between the Flakes and the Willises. My dad never let me know I wasn't supposed to like the Willises, so I went ahead and liked the Willises. But anyway, he did tell one story. When he was a young man, he rode lots of broncs. In fact, I guess he was almost always riding broncs. You know, today we hardly ever wait till a horse is over 2 before we start breaking him. But in those days, they rent all their horses out on the range, and they would bring them in when they were younger and brand them, and work the horses, and then they turn them back out in the pasture, and they used to run big herds of horses. And they would very seldom ever do anything more with them till they would bring them in and once a year and catch the 4-year-olds off. They let the horses go to 4 years old. They didn't use as big a horses in those days as they do today. So they have to let them get to be 4 years old to be stout enough and strong enough, and then they could make them go right to work. But a 4-year-old horse, and sometimes there was often even a stud at 4 years old, was awful strong and awful powerful. And lots of buck in them, and they would almost always buck. And some of those young men, like Henry says about them, if they didn't buck, why, they would encourage them to buck. And some of the people in those days said a horse that didn't buck wasn't worth anything, and then they would work and work and work on him to get that buck out of him. But one day he was riding a horse that was 4 years old and a raw bronc, and just riding him with a hackamore. And he was down in the big cedars right in north of town, and they were all cedars. You all know where we go down to have our cookouts and burn those dead trees. Well, in my early days, and of course in my dad's early days, they weren't down trees. They were up and growing, and when I was young, I thought that was the biggest forest in the world. And he was down in those 4-mile cedars, and he run across a big old yearling maverick bull, never been branded. And he thought, well, I'll brand the bull, I'll rope the bull and put him down and brand him, and that which was just the custom in those days. A lot of the range was open, and he says he took down his rope and tied it hard and fast, And he knew he was going to he knew his horse would buck because it was just a raw bronc. But he came up on the bull and he roped him. And as he let go of the coils in his hand, somehow it wrapped around his right hand on the wrist, just about as far out as he could reach from the saddle, and by leaning over, and it hooked over itself, or somehow went into a half hitch, and sure enough, the bull pulled him out there and hit the end of the rope. The other side was tied to the horn, and sure enough, the horse started to buck. And there was Daddy with a big old maverick yearling bull on one end of the rope, the other end tied to his saddle horn, sitting in the saddle of a horse that was bucking. And he knew that if he went out of the saddle, he was out there far enough where the horse would turn, of course, take off, and he would kick him to death and drag him. And so he says, I knew I had to keep that bull in hard enough with my hand and ride the horse until he quit bucking, until I could control that bull. And so the horse bucked, and he says there wasn't any question. That's all he could do. If not, his life wasn't worth a plug nickel. So he, with his hand out just as far as he could reach, tugging on that bull, leading out of the saddle, and the horse bucking, and I'm sure he was holding on to everything else he could with that hand, while he rode that horse down till he quit bucking. And I never did remember what he said, whether he worked it off the saddle. Well, he had to work his coils off his hand first before he could do anything else. But that was the kind of determination and the kind of sacrifice. You know, no job was too big for Daddy. No job was too big. He'd just dive into it and do it and just do whatever had to be done. And he relished work. He was a hard-working man, and he was obedient. He was obedient even to death. You know, through the things that he suffered in the last few months and the last year of his life, I wasn't around him a lot. I was around him quite a lot during the first part of it, but when he went on down to the valley and was going to the doctors, I wasn't around him a lot. But I never heard him complain, and never heard him moan and groan and say, why did it have to happen to me? And he was obedient even to death. And so I'd like to bear tribute to a good father that taught me those principles.
Tonight, if you'd like to.
David reminded me of a story that Daddy, they told about Kiwanis. When I turned 12 years old, Daddy, the day of my birthday, in fact, and Daddy was president of the Kiwanis Club, and he sent me to Kiwanis with him. And it just happened that day they decided to have a contest between me. They called me up and one other scout. His name was Keith Webb, and he was a full year older than I was. And kind of made a panel, and they was going to ask each of us 10 questions. And the boy that answered the most questions right got a prize after the questions were over. Well, Daddy was not much of an avid scouter, and for that reason, I never had taken too much interest in scouting. But anyway, they got us up, and Daddy was at the head table, and I was sitting on one side of him, and Keith was on the other, and they had the panel there asking questions, and they, one by one, they asked me the first question. They said, what's the scout oath? And I don't know. You know. They asked, so they gave the question to the other boy. He gave the scout oath, and then they asked, what are the scout laws? Heavens, I don't know. So they asked Keith Webb, and he gave them all the scout laws. And I kind of looked around at Daddy, and just starting to slink down in the chair. Embarrassment. They went through 10 questions, and I never answered. I never knew one of them. Keith Webb, who was pretty well schooled in scouting by then, he answered every one of them perfectly. And I turned around, Daddy, that's the only time I think I've ever seen Daddy blush and be terribly embarrassed, but he was embarrassed. Also, to introduce this song, when I was a young boy, we had a horse, a colt born on the ranch. It was a pretty colt, and we never did give him a name, Daddy said, well, let's wait and break him and see what he turns out to be before we give him a name. By the time he was 2 years old, well, he was a big strapping colt and probably one of the prettiest colts that ever raised on the place. And I was too young to be a bronc buster, and I remember Jake was in high school, a pretty good sized kid. And back in those days, we'd always, before we went on a solo ride by ourselves on the horse, we'd always take him and snub him up to an old gentle horse, snub him up to the saddle horn and lead him around for a while and get the horse used to the rider. And so we did that, and one of the best places we had to break a horse was down by Lifford Webb's Arena, you know where Terry Penrod's place is. Down, and that was just a big old sandy flat down there, and the horse, if he did start bucking, well, he couldn't buck too hard because the sand was so deep, and it was an effort for him to buck. I always remember that first solo ride, and Daddy picked Jake to ride this horse and took him down there, and I guess he led him around for 45 minutes. And finally, he said, Jake, do you think you can handle him? And Jake said, yeah, I can handle him. And he turned him loose, and Jake rode him around a little while and dug the spurs in him one too many times, and this horse busted loose. And the thing that I can remember best about that ride is Jake going up in the air, and he turned a complete somersault in the air and come down on his back. And so Daddy says, I think we'll call this horse Walking John. And that was a familiar name to us because Walking John was a song that he used to sing. And Cleona, 2 or 3 years ago, gave me the words to this song, and I memorized it. And I'll try to make the words match Stephen's guitar if I can. Oh, Walking John was a narrow horse from over Morongo way. When you laid your twine on a rag and steer, old John was there to stay. So long as your rope was stout enough and your terrapin shell stayed on, Dallywell, the hard or fast, it was all the same to John. He was said just to be an old broomtail, short-footed and Spanish broke. But I'm telling the God-forsaken world, he sure did enjoy his joke. As sure as the morning sun come up, he'd bog his head right down, till your shaft stuck out like angel's wings and your hat was a floating crown. Now Bob was a limpin', was sore, and Tex he couldn't walk. Someone said, let's call him Walking John because he's making so many walks. But shucks, he got sold to a livery who was willing to take a chance on John becoming a gentleman and not afraid of those English pants. Perhaps it was the sight of those toy balloons that was tied on those tourist legs kept John a-guessing from that time on, and he stepped like he walked on eggs. As smooth as soap, this tourist dude bogged down in the pair of chaps, and the rest of his ignorance from disguised in the rig that he wore, perhaps. Come sauntering up to the livery, well, he asked for to see the boss. The boss, he savvied his number right, and he gave him a gentle hoss. Now Walking John, he hadn't pitched from the year come 1st of June, but I'm telling the cockeyed universe, we sure recollected soon. Now someone rang the breakfast gong, though we'd all had our meat. John, he started to bust in two with his fiddle between his feet. That dude went up like a sailing bat, he went floating across the sky. He wasn't 6'4" to 88, but partner, he sure did fly. We picked him out of a bush, part of his clothes stayed on. We mended his coats and we wired his folks, it was all the same to John. Okay now, Grandma.
I'm the mistress. What's that one?
For a few teenagers, I'll make it short.
Dance is over.
Oh, the dance is over, okay. Grandpa died. Flake died when Jonay was 6 months old. But get an idea how few of you kids knew anything about Grandpa Flake. And he was a very tall man, and you'll never believe it, but he was a very, very thin man. Your Grandpa Flake had great discipline. If we baked a whole lot of cookies, he would come in and maybe take one cookie, and that was all he'd ever eat. He just didn't do like we all do and eat a dozen. And that's he maintained. He was very disciplined. He never ate between meals. He ate his breakfast, a huge breakfast, and a big dinner, and at night it was bread and milk, and it didn't matter what else we had. He had bread and milk, and that was it. And pies and cakes and cookies never tempted Daddy. And so I always admired the great discipline he had for his body. And I don't know why we didn't inherit it. One thing I thought of when Jetty was talking was his Levi's. And as I was looking at his Levi's, you boys would never believe it, you girls, because I have Levi's every single week. They get worn 2 or 3 days and then get put to wash. Daddy never washed his Levi's, ever. He would buy a brand new pair of Levi's, and that was for dress. And he would wear them for dress. And the next oldest pair would be worn for something else, for some chores that didn't get very dirty. And his oldest pair of Levi's would be for the butchering. And he had different clothes for everything. And now sometimes we'll just take the clothes he's got on and go use them for something grubby and then ruin them. But Daddy never did that. He had great discipline with his clothes. He had certain Levi's for this, certain Levi's for this, and this and this. And by the time they were butcher Levi's, they were so stiff, they could just stand up. You could sit in the middle of the room and they could stand up because they'd never been washed. They still were stiff like new Levi's are. And yet they'd been worn for months and months and months. So Daddy had some interesting help. And a lot of them, I think, have been blessings to us, but a lot of them we haven't kept on with, which we should have. I remember 2 things I just thought I would mention. Great honesty. I remember being with him at one time when he just sold a very happy with the price that he got for all those cattle. He was very pleased with it. And a week or so later, he was talking to someone, and I happened to be there. And this man says, "Aren't you quite unhappy? The man that bought your cattle didn't even handle them. He just took them from you, turned around and sold them somewhere else, and received 2 or 3 times more than what you received for them. It was just a transaction like that." And Daddy said, "No, I don't feel bad at all about it. I got a fair price." And it didn't bother him in any way that someone else had made far more than he had for his work, because he felt like he got an honest price. And as a little girl, I remember how that impressed me, that Daddy was totally honest in his dealings. And another thing, all you boys who've been in the corrals rounding up and working with cattle, you know how hard it is. And yet, as a girl who spent a lot of time with my dad in the corral, I never ever heard my dad utter an oath of any kind, nor a swear word. And I appreciate that. Some of the boys may have heard it, but I didn't. I never ever heard any kind of a swear word. I know I used to get angry.
Say dadgummit.
Yeah, dadgummit. But I never ever heard him utter an oath or a swear word. And so I appreciated my father for that. He taught me discipline, which I haven't learned too much of, But he taught me obedience, like they've talked about. He taught me honesty. And there are so many things that I have appreciated about my father, and I've paid great tribute to him. I thought of a dozen things when they were talking because it brought so many memories. But because the evening's going on, I'm going to stop here and just let you kids know that you had a marvelous grandfather. And I hope every one of you can learn to know something about him. You will never know him until you go into the next world. But I hope you know him when you see him because you've studied and learned something about him from we as parents and from others. And I say this to you, that you have a great grandfather, and we had a great father, and my mother had a great husband. Daddy was a great man to discipline. As we've mentioned, he was very disciplinarian, and my mother gave a lot of love. And so they were a very great combination, the two things together. And so I do pay great tribute to my father.
Grandma? Leon's next, isn't she?
No, Grandma.
Do you want to sit on this chair, Grandma?
You kids know how Grandpa used to get the kids out in the morning when he wanted them to get downstairs quick. He'd call up and he'd say, "The first one down will get a nickel." And they would just fall out of bed and pull their clothes on and dash down the stairs to get a nickel.
That must have been the later kids, because I don't remember it.
Maybe it was a dime once in a while, but it wasn't very much.
Sit down, fella. I can't see
But that
you.
shows they didn't know what it was to have much money to spend. They'd just be tickled to death to get downstairs to get that nickel or dime. When Cleon mentioned his honesty, I wanted to tell, he used to buy fat cows from the dairy, and he'd butcher them and take them up to White River and sell them, and then if he felt like sometimes he got more than he would buy them. He bought them from Roy Palmer. And he'd pay Roy so much for them. And then he'd take them up and he'd sell them. And most people, if they could make a little extra money, they would think that's made a good deal. But if he made a little extra money, more than he felt like he deserved, he went back and paid Roy Palmer more. And Roy Palmer talks about that all the time, about his honesty. And seeing that Roy got a good share to himself. So I appreciated that. One time I went out with him on the range and we went clear out past Buckhorn pasture and we got stuck in the mud. And usually Daddy could get us out, but this way he could not get the pickup out. It was just really stuck. And so the only thing for us to do was to walk. We didn't have any way to get back to walk. And so both of us walked together. That's a long ways. It was on the other side of Buckhorn until we got to the street where we caught a ride home. And I always remember that was the most enjoyable time walking with him here from Buckhorn and walk slowly and had a good chance to visit and talk, and I enjoyed it very, very much. When I first met Virgil, he was a missionary in the mission field, and he and his companion, he had a companion named Elder Fossey, and he had red hair, and his hair just kind of stuck straight up, and one time my companion and I, it was just before Valentine, and we went out tracking, and we thought, well, we'd play a joke on the two elders at the mission home, Elder Flake and Elder Fossey. We bought a couple of Valentines, and we thought we was going to send them, and they wouldn't know who sent them. And so the one we sent to Elder Fossey would show the kind of a cannibal with his hair standing straight up and said, "I'm wild about you." And the next one we sent to Elder Flake was a cat and a dog, and the dog was saying to the cat, "Don't purr around me unless you mean it." Well, we put those address those to the two elders and sent them in the mail. And the next morning when I went over to the office to pick up our mail, as soon as I went in, why, Elder Flake and Elder Paulson says, "Come over here, Sister Hendrickson, we want to see your print." I have printed the letters. Anyway, they found out who sent them. And we had a lot of fun over that. Well, Virgil was a great, we never had much courtship until after we were married. Because we just got engaged through letters and got married and come to Snowflake. But he was a great lover. After we got married, he took me to all the dances, he took me everywhere, he took me horseback riding, which I was all scared of. And he'd take me down to catch horses. I was always scared, even to this day. He'd go down and he'd have about 6 horses to catch. And he'd go out to catch them, and I was supposed to hold them. I was always afraid they were going to bite me or something. I never was really at home around horses. And I wish sometimes that I could have matched him and his love for horses, and I was always scared of him. Anyway, I'm very grateful for Virgil. I've always said if to do over again, I'd do the very same thing. When he wrote and asked me to marry him, I just knew him as a missionary. I haven't seen him haven't been with him for 2 years. And he kept me, once in a while he'd write me a letter and tell me he wanted to go to school up at Logan. And he'd come by and Salt Lake, he'd ask me the news about the missionaries. And I'd answer it and tell him what news I knew. And then he wrote and told me, he said, "I guess I'm not going to get to go to college." He said, "My father has a chance." He said, he was going to send me up to Logan to college. But if I go, he has a chance to buy the Flying V Ranch. And if he buys that, he won't be able to send me to college. And he wanted his father to buy that ranch so bad that he passed up going to college. And the thing that I did appreciate in it is when our boys graduated from high school, I thought as busy as he was, and as busy as he could keep his boys, I wondered if he would spare them to go on. But he wanted every one of his sons to graduate from college. And daughters too, if they would. And 6 of them did graduate from college. And the others went until they got married. So I really appreciated that he wanted his children to go on to college, because I think and I appreciate the many lessons that he has taught, and I hope that you kids that didn't get to know him, someday you'll know him. He wanted so much to live and see all the grandkids come up, that someday you'll get to know him and meet him, and someday we'll still be a family on the other side. I say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Grandma Flake. I want to thank all of you who participated. We'd like to have a closing song. Cleon will announce that, and Ben will say the closing prayer.
We thought we'd have this program about Grandpa Flake tonight because, when he first died 19 years ago, we talked a lot about him for a few years, and then I got to thinking the other day, the younger children don't hear too much about Grandpa Flake. So this is why we have this program tonight. So I hope you feel like you know him better now. I'll have to tell something funny about Grandma. You boys that work on the range will appreciate this. I was coming home from old Brandon with her one time, and she had a horse in the back of the pickup, and she didn't know the gate was closed and drove right through it. I remember how mad my dad the vet to close on us. I sing Live at Home for us every day. There is beauty all around when there's love at home. There is joy in every sound when there's love at home. Peace and plenty here abide, smiling sweet on every side. Kindness softly, sweetly glide, when there's love at home. Love at home. Love at home. Kindness softly, sweetly glide, when there's love at
Father in heaven, we're thankful that we can gather around here tonight and learn about Grandpa Flake. We hope that we can have a good reunion. We're thankful for the opportunity to have a reunion, and we can all get together and see each other. And bless Grandma Flake and bless the family. We hope that we can have a safe time. Say in Jesus Christ, amen.
Probably will. How you doing? Good to see you. It's not even dark yet.
Well, we went 3 parts.
I don't know. It's in the car. We just didn't know which one. Right down there at the van. A park with the stream by it.
Guys, we can all go in our van.
Settle it down. It's so warm here.
Am I getting up to the coast now?
Yeah. The Zoom will take it right on up.
Uncle Jay! Uncle Jay! Okay, thank you, folks. He's a very ugly boy. Uncle Jay! I think it's time to eat.
Hey, how about me?
Get in there, then.
Okay. Where? Jake?
Get in there.
Oh, yeah.
Wait, Amy. Just let someone let Amy take it.
Hey, he got it! Paul! Hello, folks! Hello, yes! Hey! I know, but I need to get one more. Come on, Davey! TV!
That's plenty.
Steve, where's my camera? Nathan, find my camera.
Where your camera is?
That's Steve, yeah, honey.
Go eat. Vámonos. Sit still.
Hey, you kids, don't be lifting those things.
Sorry, Sheila, I'm bigger than you.
So Dahlia would still be there.
I don't know if Dahlia's bigger than her or not. Not by much.
Hi.
Yeah, but I'm Dina.
Where's Nolan?
Dahlia's not.
Where's Nolan? I want to get him.
Nolan to come down here. Joe?
Well, careful, Steve.
They're not here.
Where are they at?
No.
Up. His hair curls.
Hey, Tom, you look cool.
Stand back a little ways. You're too close. Okay, Tyler, it's so good.
She knows her. Why do you know? Sterling, look at that.
Okay, I get what I can be. You need to stand over on this side, Sterling, so I can go get the light behind you.
Who's next? Me? Joe's next. No, it was Joe.
Let's see your shoes.
Okay, just real quick, I see the picture. It's a little fluffier. No. Hey, you guys. Hey, put on that makeup.
Did you get your hair curled, Kay?
Yeah, I know. We took one down the Grand Canyon.
Jake. Uncle Jake.
Read something.
We're going to the trailer to take that pen, aren't you?
Big bottle.
Hey, don't! You're going to get burned.
Well, that's what